All right, so before I get started, I just want to say Rails 3.00 Beta 4 is out, along with Bundler 1.0 Beta 1. And if we're all lucky, we'll get the RC out before the end of this week. In order to do that, everybody needs to be trying to upgrade your apps on Beta 4 so we can do a quick RC. People will be around, so find any core team members or anybody who knows what's going on around, and we'll help you upgrade. So let's get that done. Before I start, I just want to thank Engine Yard for just bringing me down here, paying for all the work I do, and being a sponsor of RailsConf, so let me say that. Let me turn on my remote. So I usually give talks about code. My talks are usually very technical. And I'm actually going to be giving a birds of a feather tonight about code if anybody's interested. But tonight I'm going to be talking about something else. I'm going to be talking about the Ruby community. It's something I wish everybody was a bigger part of. And I understand that often when people start to look at what they can do, how they can get involved, it feels overwhelming. It's very hard to get involved. I know that's how I felt in the beginning. Not only did it feel overwhelming, I didn't even know where to begin. If you look at the Perl community, Perl says that Perl is about making easy things easy and hard things possible. And something I've learned over a couple of years, 4 years, working with Rails and Ruby, is that the Ruby community goes a step further than that. The Ruby community says, if it's easy, why am I thinking about it at all? Make easy things trivial. And who cares if it's hard? It should be easy. And Rails actually proved that, right? Rails proved that just because something's hard doesn't mean it has to be merely possible. It should be easy. And finally, just because it's impossible doesn't mean it shouldn't be possible. Let's make impossible things possible. So you guys probably don't know who this is, but you probably know his story. This guy's name is George Dantzig. He's the famous story of the guy who went into a classroom. He saw 2 problems on the board. He wrote it down. Then he went home and solved it, and he got a call from his professor a couple months later or weeks later. And his professor said, hey, you want to co-sign this paper I published on your proofs of unsolved math theorems? So this is a famous story. You probably have heard that story in Good Will Hunting or whatever. What you probably haven't heard is that this guy actually is pretty seminal in computing. And he actually was one of the original guys who worked with the military on logistics and eventually did a lot of the seminal work on getting computing into airlines. So basically the way airlines are relatively on time, even though they have millions of people in the air, that's due to this guy. So chances are nobody in this room is as smart as this guy. But if you want to do something that might actually be impossible, you should take a look at some of these Wikipedia problems, so list of unsolved problems in mathematics. And then when you come back to Ruby, it will be really easy. And really what I'm trying to say here is that the idea of what is impossible is a relative thing. There are some things that are truly impossible, right? There are mathematical things that are mathematically impossible. But when people say to you, that's impossible, that's relative. And actually, this rolls right into my personal philosophy, something that I've been thinking about a lot since the Merb days. It's my personal philosophy on programming is to first find something that looks impossible and then do that. And that's because even though it seems impossible, you have no idea where to begin, it almost never is. Things are almost never impossible. And I actually didn't start that way. My starting in programming was, I was playing this game Nibbles, which came with QBasic on DOS 6. And I was getting angry that I kept losing, and I wanted to go figure out how to give myself unlimited lives. So my first programming experience was going into QBasic and giving myself unlimited lives in Nibbles, which is awesome. And I actually programmed a little in QBasic, and then it petered out. And in high school, I did some Visual Basic stuff without really knowing what the hell I was doing. I'm embarrassed about this. I wrote a Stardate calculator, Star Trek Stardate calculator, using Visual Basic, because it was really easy. I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't really know what programming was. But it's easy, right? And in college, I had to get some stuff up to be searched by other fellow students. And I used ASP because, again, I didn't really know what was going on, but I had an access database, and I put it on the web, and then I wrote like 12 lines of code and some HTML, and it worked. And I actually use front page a lot. I make fun of this, and everyone makes fun of this, but I didn't know what was going on, and so I knew how to use Word, and front page seemed similar, and occasionally I would like click on view source, and it was really scary during this period. But I basically didn't know anything, and I still managed to get stuff done, and I think a lot of that is how people feel about Rails often when they get started, is I don't really know what the hell's going on here, but I could get something done. That's how I felt. I started programming in 2004. I consider this my start, even though I did a bunch of things that you could consider programming before then. And my first programming experience was at a little nonprofit that had a bunch of legacy Cold Fusion and PHP stuff. I'd done some print design in college, and they were looking for a web designer, and I said, print design, web design, that's the same thing, right? And I guess the people who were hiring me also didn't know that that wasn't true. So I got the job, and I was set to work on Cold Fusion and PHP. And what's funny about Cold Fusion is it seemed all natural at the time, but then I saw Aaron Patterson's Enterprise Ruby, which is like, what if we just took all of Ruby and made XML out of it? And I realized Cold Fusion is just if that was real, but not a joke, right? And people are really using this. This is real. There's huge businesses that are built on this stuff, right? And while I'm working here, I saw that there was this thing called Ajax that had come out. It seemed important. And I went to this session by Thomas Fuchs, who was giving a session on Ajax, which was supposed to be a session on Ajax, but it was really a session on prototype and scriptaculous, and by the way, you should probably be using Rails. And so I went to this session. It was pretty awesome, and I left there really wanting to learn more about Rails because it seemed like there was a lot of stuff I didn't want to have to know. Again, I didn't really know what was going on, and I started to look into it. And I recently wrote this post on my blog called The Blind Men and the Elephant, A Story of Noobs, which was sort of me reflecting on how I felt at that point in time. And essentially, I was trying to say, a lot of people say, hey, you're a noob, what the hell, just read the manual. And the problem is that a lot of times you can look at the manual, noobs can look at the manual all day and not know what to look for, right? It's not a matter of reading the manual. You can read the manual cover to cover and not know what the question is. Similar problem to let me Google that for you, right? If you don't know what to Google, it doesn't help you that you knew that that was the right phrase. And actually, so I got started then, and I was working with Rails a little bit. In 2006, I released my first plugin, which was this thing, YHTML, which is YAML and HTML. And at the end of this, Hampton Catlin, who wrote Hamel, was like, hey, it looks like we're thinking about the same stuff. And I felt really cool because I knew how to write a recursive function. If you go look at this, it's like, wow, recursion, that's awesome. And remember, I don't have any CS experience, so that was cool for me. And I was just trying to figure out how exactly to go about getting an alternate plugin, alternate rendering engine here. And then the next thing I decided to do, because obviously everybody does this, is try to write some kind of admin panel thing using engines at the time, again, 2006. And this was pretty hard stuff, and I, again, had no idea what I was doing. But I was able to eke by and build something that I was using at work and seemed really hard, and in retrospect, probably was not where I should have gotten started. But I did some stuff. But then, again, I missed RailsConf 2006, but I didn't know that I missed RailsConf 2006. So I was starting, and I was like, OK, Rails is cool, and that was pretty much my entire world at that time. But I went to RailsConf in 2007, and I knew that I didn't like the documentation, so I went to this talk, This Birds of a Feather by Jeremy, which was about documentation. And suddenly I became aware of like the whole world of Rails, like what is going on, who's around, what people are trying to do, and other people being frustrated by documentation also. It's not just me as a noob. A lot of people are frustrated by this, and that was sort of the beginning of my getting involved. And sometime after that, Jeremy said, hey, Yehuda, you should take a look at Merb. So that was sort of the beginning of the whole thing. So at one point, a few months ago, David said, hey, you should do a 30-minute keynote. And my initial response was, the safe choice was just to do a talk on Merb, merging Merb into Rails. That was the safe choice. And that was actually what I told David initially, do a talk on merging Merb into Rails. But then I ran into this blog post that I got really angry about, and I don't know how many people saw it, but it was voted up on Hacker News a lot, and it was how to become rich even if nobody's following you on Twitter. And according to this blog post, there's two types of people in software. There's the in-crowd and there's the normals. The in-crowd lives in the US, they attended MIT or Berkeley, they write well, they have interesting blogs, they have 400 or more people on Twitter. And the reality is this, the in-crowd are going to have it so much easier. And he uses this as a platform to say what you should be doing is essentially make spam websites. Because if you're a normal, you cannot be successful in life. You have to do this crazy thing. And when he says the reality is, right, what he means is that it's another word for saying, I'm sorry, it's just impossible for you to be successful. You didn't go to MIT, sorry. And I said, I'm in the Rails community, and that's totally not true at all, right? But when I was getting started with Rails, I wouldn't have known that. I might have thought there's some clique. I've heard people talk about the Rails core team clique. Maybe it just is impossible. So when I was getting started, I was pretty confused, like I said. And occasionally people will say something these days, more advanced users, like, of course, everybody knows that this file is on the load path. And I'll usually reply, like, most people don't know what a load path is, right? So that's not going to be a good way of getting started. Be good if everyone did. So how do you get started? People ask this question to me often. So I'm interested in getting started in Rails. Like, I'm using Rails, but I want to get more involved. What do I do? And actually, I didn't know the answer, but now I know the answer. There's this guy, Santiago Pastorino. It's him. And actually, he doesn't live in the United States. He didn't attend MIT or Berkeley. He writes better English than I write Spanish, but he's not a fluent American speaker. But what he does have is a willingness to work really hard. And if you look at contributors.rubyonrails.org, you see that he's, I guess, number 6 for the year, 188 commits. And what are those 188 commits? Well, the first month or two of his 188 commits, he eliminated warnings. So if you run rake on Rails, you get a huge spewing of warnings. And it got worse on 192. And Santiago, again, he was pretty new to Rails, probably not as green as I was when I got started, but pretty new. He said, these warnings are annoying. Can I get rid of them? That's really what he did. He just eliminated warnings. If you look at the first 100 of his commits, it's like, I've eliminated this uninitialized instance variable warning. And basically what that means is that he was able to get up and running. He was able to get his development environment working. He was able to get help from people who were able to help him without having to jump in and try to do something crazy, right? Something that you would submit this huge 1,000-line patch, and we would look at it and say, we're too busy to evaluate this right now. Maybe we'll look at it later, right? He got in doing something seemingly trivial, and now he's done 200 commits this year, right? And the thing is that when he got started, it's not as though he eliminated warnings and it was all great from there, right? He obviously hit barriers, got frustrated. Some people might have told him it was impossible, but it wasn't, right? So that's how you should get started. Now, the next question people ask me is, how do I become awesome? So now I've gotten started. I have my Rails development environment working. How do I become awesome? And I'll just repeat what I said, which is, this is what I do. Find something impossible and do it. So impossible doesn't only have to mean technically impossible. Nick, he's Crush on Twitter, he said, this RubyForge thing sucks. RubyForge was great. It was something that came out of the Forge system. It works well. It's like keeping people's gems working. But wouldn't it be great if we had like a Ruby thing instead of a PHP thing? And so he did. He made rubygems.org, and now rubygems.org is the thing that everybody uses for gems. And we can now push gems without some crazy additional gem that we have to use and hope screen scraping works. And actually, when I heard about this the first time, I said it was impossible, right? I said the institutional pressures of RubyForge and replacing that and RubyGems and all this stuff just makes it impossible. But the fact is that I was wrong. And I was wrong because I failed to see that with enough work and enough impetus, you could pretty much get past almost any social problem in the Ruby community. Anything where you think, that guy's just a dick, basically. We're never going to get past that. And that wasn't the issue here. But sometimes it's just social issues, and you think it's impossible, and it is not. And so another guy, this is more of a technical thing, Michael, not Mikkel. It's Michael. It's like Kal-El, right? So Michael, he was the maintainer of Tmail. And Tmail is a gem that existed for a really, really long time. Came out in September 1999. I think it probably came out before then, so like 072 or whatever was out in September 1999. And getting this library right means reading hundreds of pages of RFCs. And Michael said, you know what, it would be great if we didn't have this really old, crufty library that someone wrote in 1999 that's impossible to maintain, that's the basis of the entire ActionMailer system in Rails. And eventually, he did rewrote Mail. And if you look at his announcement, he said, "I tested against the entire Enron set and the Trek 2005 set without crashing." And this without crashing thing is sort of a reference to this joke that if you want to find out if a mail is spam in old Rails, you just run it through Tmail, and if your Rails process crashes, it's spam. So now I guess we lost the spam prevention mechanism. But this is really hard. This is a hard task. It involves really understanding the RFCs really well. It involves running it through some very vigorous testing. And rewriting Tmail, rewriting ActionMailer, these are things that are really hard, that somebody might have said are impossible. And certainly getting to the point where it's as compatible as it is today, where you could take ActionMailer 2.3 chunks of your application, put them in 3.0, and everything still works, that's really hard. Somebody might say impossible, right? But it's not, and it's done. Another similar case is Aaron. Aaron's sort of the epitome of this. This is Aaron. This is one of many pictures of Aaron. I'm sure there are many more awesome ones. He's Tenderlove on Twitter. And he's taken on jobs like Nokogiri, Johnson, Psych, and like a huge list of other things that are so crazy as to probably actually be impossible. Psych is the one I'm going to talk about today. Basically, Psych is what you're using when you say require YAML inside of Ruby. And what Aaron said was that this relatively unmaintained YAML library should be replaced with something that works with libyaml, which is a C library, and should work. It should work on Windows and should work on JRuby and whatnot. And actually, if you go look at YAML, just go through, let's say this is my Ruby directory, there's a huge amount of usage of YAML. And they're all using really obscure features. So if you ask Aaron, he'll tell you that the hardest part of this project wasn't re-implementing YAML, because obviously he had the C library to work with. The hardest part was going and finding out all the crazy things people were doing, including Rails. And then it turned out that the Ruby guys said, it's not enough for you to get everybody who's doing crazy stuff to fix it. You have to actually implement all the weird quirks. And again, this is a hard job, and it's the sort of hard job that Aaron does over and over again. So Aaron does, in Nokogiri, Aaron had to deal with really crazy garbage collection quirks. In Johnson, I still don't know if it's actually possible because it's still occasionally seg faults, but making two garbage collectors work well together, these are really hard tasks. So I have basically one more guy before I move on, Jose. Jose, this is his thing. So Jose was somewhat involved in the Rails community. I think I didn't know him before last year, Ruby Summer of Code or Google Summer of Code. And he did a bunch of stuff. Most of the stuff is pretty recent. You probably know about like Rails footnotes and devise. So he was involved in Google Summer of Code, and he took on this project that was Build Agnostic Generators. And I definitely heard people say, this is a unicorn project. Like, this is not real. Like, this is too hard. It's not well defined. And he actually did finish it. And he finished it with enough time left over to do another project that was really hard. And now he's on the Rails core team. So the thing is that these guys, do they have CS degrees? None of them have CS degrees. A lot of them aren't American, right? Are they the epitome of what this guy said the in-crowd is? No, right? These guys are not the in-crowd. What they have in common is a willingness to work really hard and a willingness to see things to the end. And probably at this point, you've heard me talk about a lot of things that probably do seem impossible to you. And so you're thinking, what can I do? I'm just one person. There's a million Rails developers. What can I do? And the thing is that one person actually matters. So here's an example of one person mattering. Xavier, this is him, FXN on Twitter. Xavier works on Doc Rails. He does a huge amount of the work on Doc Rails. And here's a list of his commits. So this is like June 8th, June 7th, June 7th, June 7th, June 7th, June 6th, right? So he does a ton of the work on Doc Rails. He has 712 commits. And he's basically the only one doing a huge amount of this work. So there are people that contribute some to Doc Rails, and that's definitely awesome. But he's one guy, right? And he's one guy who makes a difference between very poor, not maintained documentation and very good, well-maintained documentation. Now imagine if we had two people doing that. That would be huge, right? And this is not really a very hard project. If you want to get involved and work a lot on documentation, there's a lot of typos. There's a lot of cases where we just got something wrong in the documentation, right? So there's no reason why you can't get involved on what seems like a relatively easy project even though it seems like maybe this should be covered already, right? Maybe it seems like, oh, there's probably like 45 people working on this project. There aren't. And you would think that harder projects maybe are different, right? Maybe that is a property of easy projects like documentation, but surely hard projects have a lot of people working on them, so there's no place to get involved. So I'll just look at Rubinius, which for the longest time had two guys, Evan, that's Evan in his fun hat, he's that on Twitter, and Brian. Those are two guys that for the longest time were doing the vast majority of the commits on Rubinius, which is a fully compatible Ruby implementation that's basically as fast as 1.8 now, right? So that's two guys. Imagine if there were three guys. And similarly, JRuby is basically, with the community, of course, three full-time guys, Charlie, Tom, and Nick, right? Three guys. And even though this is a project that's three guys working on a fully compatible Ruby interpreter, they have the cojones to say stuff like this. Right? People eventually do want Ruby code to run as fast as C or Java, and if we can make it happen, we should. Even though they have three guys and a community, of course, working on a really, really hard, almost impossible project, they're still saying things that sound impossible. But I, for one, am not willing to take that bet. I actually think that over time, just the same way that Java was once said, can Java ever be as fast as C? And everyone said, ha. Bytecoded languages can't be as fast as C, and it didn't turn out that way. I, for one, am not willing to take the bet against Charlie and Tom and Nick. And Evan and Brian, of course. So what's the way to the in crowd, if there is such a thing in the Ruby community? How do you get there? So let me let you in on a secret, except this secret is not a scam and it's free. Am I going to get sued now? I feel. All right. So the secret is that nobody turns down hard work. If you're willing to go to any project, no matter how hard it is, and put in some work, there's basically no open source project that will turn you down. And again, Santiago is a good example of this. Most projects, virtually all projects, will get you through really annoying, not contributing very much, just trying to get up and running, how do I get my development environment working, if you're willing to put in hard work. Basically every open source project does that. If you want to level up fast, work on Rubinius or JRuby. As an example, I wrote this in Rubinius back in my days where I didn't know what was going on. I wrote that and a lot of other string. And of course, when Rubinius 1.0 comes out, they actually still haven't rewritten my code. But this is several years ago, actually. This is code from a few years ago when I was just trying to get started. I didn't really know what was going on. I knew Rubinius was written in Ruby. I knew some Ruby. I felt really excited that I knew what a parser was. And I was like, I'll just write this. And Evan said, you know what, just write it. We need something that works. We'll worry about performance later. Now's the time, I guess. But the bottom line is that I was able to do something that I think most people would not have done. Most people would not have gone to Rubinius and decided to write parts of string because it seems hard. It's who knows if Evan will help you out. And he did. He got me up and running. There's been a huge amount of time that he spent with me saying I can't make Rubinius compile relative to the amount of work I think I've put in. But the bottom line is that people will help you. Now, again, at this point, you still might not know where to start, and I would say scratch your own itch. And you probably heard that a lot. But I think when people say scratch your own itch, often people feel like it's impossible. Right? I have a problem. I want a better headless JavaScript thing. That's just impossible. There are a ton of projects everywhere in Ruby doing all kinds of crazy stuff. There's libraries making PDFs. In pure Ruby, there's libraries that are making headless browsers. Right? There's libraries to do almost anything, and almost all these libraries could use an extra guy. Almost all these libraries would love to have one guy. Not only would they love to have one guy, they're going to drop everything to help you, assuming that you can demonstrate you're going to do some work. And again, I'll reiterate the secret, which is that nobody turns down an offer to do work, except maybe ZenSpider. So that's sort of that's an in-crowd joke. So there are, of course, people that will turn down an offer to do work, but you'll figure that out pretty quickly. So the thing to remember after all this is that there's this guy, Danzig, and what he proved is that impossible is really a state of mind. Obviously, there are things that are impossible, but the bottom line is that there is no reason. If you think of something as possible, you'll get a lot further than if you think of it as impossible. Unlike that blog post, you don't have to live in San Francisco. You don't have to go to MIT. You just have to do work, right? You don't have to know somebody on the Rails core team. You don't have to live in the United States. You don't have to even speak English very well. You simply need to put in the effort. And the thing is that nobody, and I mean nobody, gets from 0 to 60 overnight. So pretty much everyone that you look up to and you say, wow, Aaron Patterson, he's awesome. Like, he does some crazy stuff. He didn't start off writing Nokogiri, right? Basically, nobody goes from 0 to 60 overnight. And there's some great books that if I wanted to, I could talk about and show you slides. But there's a bunch and studies that basically say that people don't go from 0 to 60 overnight in general. People go from 0 to 60 as a result of putting in work, as a result of pushing themselves beyond their normal limits. And it's definitely not easy, right? You shouldn't leave here and feel like, oh, I know the secret now. It's easy. It's not easy, but it's definitely not impossible. So with that said, enjoy the rest of RailsConf. Thank you very much.